I believe that a lot of you know about my partner, David Alves. He's my business partner, he's a friend, but most importantly, I recently found out that he is a nationally ranked pinball player. Did I say that correctly? Yes, so you should look him up. He's nationally ranked. And he has a few machines at his garage. But with that, I'm going to turn this over to David.
Great, thank you. And just because I'm ranked doesn't mean I'm ranked very well. So I think I'm like 9,000th or something like that. But thank you for having me. My name is David Albee. I'm an audit partner here at Mason Associates, and we're going to talk about fighting fraud with internal controls and why combating fraud is so important at our local government or our district where we are. Why we really should be keeping that on the front of our minds. And here's our old picture. It's great wearing the headset because you can't see my gray hair anymore, but definitely gotten a little bit grayer since last time that picture was taken. So some of the topics we're going to be going over today, we're going to be looking at the integrated framework for internal controls that the SCO has released and go through kind of in detail why those are important to us. We're going to look at the 5 elements of internal controls and really kind of hone down on each of those and how that fits within our organization. We're going to kind of go into where fraud typically happens, at least from what we see at these local governments, and how can we fight that fraud. So jumping right in, really the definition of fraud is key to me, at least. It's not a mistake. It has to be a wrongful or criminal deception intended to result in financial or personal gain. So this is not a mistake. Humans are humans. We have internal controls in place to find errors or fraud. But when we're talking about fraud, that intent, that financial gain is really the key. And I've been reading one of my favorite books actually to read through every once in a while is called Lie Spotters. And one of the things that she says in that book is that a lie, because typically fraud involves a lie, has no power in its inception, right? It has to be taken as truth for the lie to become a lie. And so the act must be intentional, so not a mistake. It has to be misleading. So, you're trying to sign a check for company A and the fraudster changed it to company B, false invoices, and it has to result in a personal gain. And that can be monetary. We're going to look at mostly things around cash and investment or cash and disbursements for taking money out in terms of fraud prevention. But it also could be non-monetary, emotional gain, feeling good that you helped out that coworker. It all could be conversion, right? If you're using the company work truck on the weekend to move or something like that. So you got to think of it outside the box that it's not always going to be cash. It could be that non-cash items. And coming up with our plan, because what's the saying? By failing to plan, you plan to fail, right? Is that what it is? But we have to look at our internal control structure in 3 areas. We got to look at it from an operational, a reporting, and a compliance. The internal controls are mechanisms, of rules and procedures put in place by your organization to ensure the integrity of financial and accounting information, right? To promote that accountability and prevent that fraud. So they've got to be operating effectively and efficiently. So we have to make sure they're running correctly. They have to safeguard our assets, right? To prevent that fraud from happening. They have to help us in reporting, to make sure that we can actually report out reliable information. And they have to be set up to make sure that we fall in compliance with laws and regulations. And besides complying with laws and regulations and preventing employees from stealing our assets or committing fraud, the internal controls really should be set to improve the operational efficiency by improving the accuracy and timeliness of the financial information that comes out, right? So protecting our assets is there, preventing fraud from happening, but it's not the overall reason for internal control systems. So who's responsible for this plan? And it's really management is responsible. And it's their duty, and we'll go through the triangle, to set up, design, implement, and maintain a system of internal controls. The governing body is there to make sure that management is doing its job. And sometimes at some of our clients, we have other committees that report to the governing body, and this could be the audit committee. And that's set up to more refine, to more have that in-depth communication with the auditor and really get involved in that internal control structure. Very few of my clients have internal auditors, but the ones that do, again, we want to make sure that that they're part of this plan, right? This plan to protect the assets of the organization. One thing you don't see on this list is the auditor. The auditor is not in the internal control environment, right? We are an outside party looking in. And I think sometimes there's an expectation gap that the auditor is part of the internal control environment. And that usually comes up in my communication with audit committees and boards or city council members. But we've got to really teach our governing body that the auditors are not part of the internal control environment. And that is so important that in 2013, the our audit standards were changed. And it clearly dictates now, or comes out in our opinion, of what management's responsibility is for the financial statements, right? And we're looking for fair presentation and preparation of those financials. And it's management's responsibility to design, implement, and maintain a system of internal controls to reduce the risk of material misstatement due to fraud or error, okay? And so that happened in 2013, that part of our audit standards have changed and changed the boilerplate language on our opinion. But the state controller's office also started to see a trend of issues at local government. In 2011, the city of Bell, there were some unethical practices there that I'm sure people are aware of. In 2012, there was a city up in this area in Northern California where there was an allegation of fraud, and when the state controller's office went into audit, they found absolutely no internal controls. So that caused a problem, and when there's a problem in government, they do an assembly bill. So Assembly Bill 1248 was issued in August of 2013, and it basically said that, hey, SEO, you have to come up with a system, a guideline for internal controls for local government. And so we have now, and hopefully everyone knows about it, this internal control guideline at our disposal. And it was really set up by the AICPA, the Government Accountability's Office of Management and Budget, COSO, and Institute of Internal Auditors, and just kind of an overall guideline, right? Because they wanted this to be a guideline that originally they were going to make it like a law, but it just didn't fit in terms of the size and nature of the local governments. You know, I have clients that have 4 people at them, and then other clients with 2,600. So there's really no one size fits all approach. And they really want to say that a well-managed framework of internal control must provide for favorable control environment, right, with periodic risk assessments, which is designed, implemented, and managed, right, has to be managed by management, to provide effective control activities that should allow the user timely information and communication, which will be used to ongoing monitoring the effectiveness of the control-related policies and procedures. Okay, so we have a favorable environment with periodic risk assessments. We have to design our control activities. We have to talk as auditors and, well, as accountants. Some of us don't like to talk too much, but we have to talk and we have to monitor our system. So the 5 areas, they spell out crime. You know, you have the the control activities, the risk assessment, the information communication, monitoring, and control environment crime. So always remember when you're thinking about your internal controls, we don't want to cause crime, but it spells out to crime. And the COSO cube, as it's known, is kind of what everyone associates with this, and I'm sure you've seen this visualization. And the interesting thing about this is where we have our three internal control parts on the top, from operating and reporting and the compliance aspect, and we have our 5 control activities, right? But we also have in this visualization kind of how it works within the organization. It has to be all the way up from the functional level all the way up to the entity-wide, any level. You could have really good control activity at your local pool. They're collecting cash, they got good cash receipts and all that, but that has to be all the way up through the organization, all the way up to that operating unit, that division, and then the government in total. And one thing that we typically find during our audits is there's almost like this, it's called a halo effect, where somebody is put up on a pedestal, usually city manager, a general manager, even department heads, where even though there's good internal controls at the agency, maybe they're a little bit more laxed for the city manager because nobody wants to call out the city manager on their expense report, or nobody wants to question something on a general manager's timesheet or pay rate or anything like that. So we have to make sure that it's at the functional level, but all the way up through our environment or our organization that we're looking at these 5 elements. And we like to show it, so got our polling question. We like to show it as a triangle here because the first one, that control environment, is really the foundation, right? It's really, we got to get everyone on board. It's the theory behind the whole system of internal controls. You really want to develop a good ethical base to start, and it's really the tone at the top, right? We want to get okay, so share results here. Oh, all right, sorry, Captain, I'll stop playing with that. We really want to get a good tone at the top, right? One second. Okay, we want to make sure that our base of our COSO cube or COSO triangle, that case, is strong, and the tone at the top is important. And really want to start to develop a culture of a see something and say something culture, where when people see issues arise, they communicate it. And from the control environment, we have 3 different areas. You have it from a functional level. So because management and the governing body are tasked with creating this internal control environment, they actually have to know that that's their job, right? They have to know what their function is at the organization. Audit committees need to know what they're supposed to be doing, why they're talking to the auditor, what their role is. Their activities have to be relevant. We have some clients that have audit committees that never meet, or maybe only meet once a year. So is that truly the base that you want for your internal control environment, that they have to meet regularly to keep assessing changing environments? And is there an attitude and awareness, right? Do they have the correct knowledge base to know what they're looking at? Are they aware that they need to review the financial reports and the memorandum on internal controls more than 5 minutes before the meeting? So there has to be that base that everyone's on board. We know our functions. We're actually meeting, and we have an attitude and awareness to that internal controls is important to us. So within the control environment, the elements, right? We have to have a good integrity and ethical value needs to be important. A code of conduct, right? Hopefully everyone has their governing board go to that AB 123, the ethical training. Strong conflict of interest codes and communicating the importance of ethical values. A lot of times we find that in fraud situations that there's a wheeler dealer type attitude. People just get it done by any means and possibly by not an ethical means. That has to be communicated that ethics are important. The governing board's oversight responsibility, they have to have the skill, knowledge, and experience to review the financials, right? And to understand the risks and internal controls at the entity. Some of my audit committees that I have are maybe too skeptical, and they maybe push staff a little harder than they should. But they have to have that professional skepticism, even though they appoint management and review management's work. They have to not take things at face value from management. They have to make sure that those risks assessments are being done, that management's actually following through and looking at the risks of the environment. And they have to track audit findings, right? How do our audit committees review and make sure that those audit findings are being resolved? We have to have assignment and authority of responsibility, and this is maybe with like an investment policy. Who is responsible for compliance with the investment policy? Who is responsible for compliance with the purchasing policy? They have to assign that responsibility to staff. We have to show that we're trying to attract, develop, and retain employees. That could be by just the history of the client, the culture there. We want to make sure that we're trying to retain employees, and if there are employees that are retiring soon, that there's some kind of exit plan, some kind of contingency plan. We want to make sure we keep our competent employees and give training and mentorship. And we don't really see incentives in terms of pay at our local government, but there can be other ways to incentivize somebody to be on board with this ethical treatment and really take these internal controls very seriously. Measures and incentives. We need to make sure that people are held accountable, not just from the audit's finding standpoint, but in periodic reviews. Make sure that people know if they are not doing things correctly in the internal control environment, that's important to the organization. So some things that we see typically within a good control environment at an organization, very clear of what the review and the approval process are. If that client is sending their warrant register to their board, we want the board to know what they're looking for, why they're looking at it. We want them typically to be looking at something like that before the checks get issued, although sometimes it is kind of after the fact. If an audit committee meets only once a year, is that truly enough to have that strong base for the internal control environment? Skill sets of those in charge of governance. If they don't have the skills to understand the financial statements or how the internal control environment works or the importance of that, there are some really good high-level books that CSMFO has for governing boards, kind of like a crash course to financial statements and internal controls. I highly recommend that you pass that information on to your governing board. And then high turnover of employees at any level. We want to make sure that when we assign our duties in our control environment or control activities, that we assign by position and not by employee. So when people leave, those clear definitions of what people's responsibility is, management or other, is defined by person. So if somebody transitions out, that is not dropped. So risk assessment. Now we do this kind of as auditors when we're doing our audit. We're constantly doing risk assessments, where we think the risks are, how can we mitigate those risks in financial reporting, right? But you have to be doing those as well as part of your internal control. So we have our base, everyone's on board. We want there to be strong internal controls. We want ethical behavior. Now, where do we need to focus? Okay. And this is done by this flow chart, right? We need to identify areas that are relevant to preparation of financial reports and fair financial reporting. But we need to look at the risky areas, including fraud risk, but it also could be risk of non-compliance, right? We need to estimate what the significant risk would be. You know, what would that cost be if that, you know, new pool that we opened up, if that cash was gone missing, or if there wasn't very good controls there. We need to assess the likelihood of something happening there. What would happen there? And then the decision needs to be made of, do we need to set up a control or set up some kind of policy and procedure to make sure that we mitigate that identified risk? And like I keep saying, this is an ongoing process. I just had a SAS 99 communication with a board member the other day, and was talking about, just from an audit standpoint, this risk assessment. My risk assessment in February 2020 was a lot different than in February 2021. So it's the environment is always changing, even without a pandemic. You know, new GASB's coming out. Are we identifying that's a potential risk, right? We had a class on GASB 87 with the leases. A risk is that we're going to miss a lease that was not identified. So we need to make sure we're talking to all of our departments about other leases that maybe finance doesn't know about. So that's a risk. You know, a new ERP system, that's a risk as well. It's a new process. I've seen clients run parallel systems to help mitigate that risk. New cash collection site reviews. You know, who has access to it? That's a new identified risk. So some ways that we want strong risk assessment: staff training at various levels to let them know that they are part of the risk assessment process. So like we had our training about GASB 87, that's, you know, we now need to identify those new leases. So that's a way that training can help you start to build that risk assessment. Changes in software could create new opportunities. A lot of clients are doing software upgrades or changes. We had a client that had a new system implemented, and they didn't realize that a lot of the user rights, there was like 15 people that had access to the AP module or something. And so some of these new systems, the way that the user access reports are different, or maybe non-existent. So we want to make sure that when things change with the software, the audit software, the financial reporting software, that those new risks are identified and mitigated. Strong year-end closing processes for those unusual or complicated transactions, making sure that all accounts are reconciled. Your capital asset, inventory, deposits. Deposits payable is usually a one that is very difficult to reconcile, and it's a risk, right? And we got to make sure that the people who's helping with the year-end process, the year-end close, has that skills, knowledge, and experience. Budget versus actual, might be missing something in the year-end close and have that swing. New staff training for just new staff coming on board, new grant programs. Amy was talking about some of the new single audit guidelines that are changing for the new grants, and even training for new operations. We don't have a lot of cities that change their operations that dramatically, but I do have some districts that have started new areas where they do need training. So that is a risk that requires to be mitigated. So new training on new development activities. So when we're going through our risk assessment, one thing really to take in is the risk of fraud, right? And we've already talked. I mean, fraud at like a local pool or some other cash collection site review. And we've all seen the fraud triangle, and I'm going to just go through just a couple of things on it. So we know that the rationalization, right? This is the justification of why that person is going to be dishonest. I deserve it, right? Everyone's got to sleep at night, and they have to rationalize it in their own head. So I deserve it. I'll pay it back later. There's all kinds of rationalizations that people have in terms of committing fraud. The opportunity. Now, this is the only thing that we can knock out of this triangle as finance people, right? Strong internal controls so they couldn't steal if they wanted to. And then the pressure. And the pressure could be anything. Could be gambling problems, could be medical bills, any kind of internal or even external pressure. We see sometimes that this is work-related, unrealistic budget goals, cash flow problems, economic decline, or it could be personal, substance abuse, gambling, excess debt, anything. But the thing that's interesting from an auditor standpoint is kind of what I said before, that the auditor is not involved in the internal control environment. When as an auditor comes in, and typically when fraud happens at an organization, it's somebody within finance that we see. And that person in finance isn't going to tell me that they're disgruntled. They're not going to tell me that they have a gambling problem. So we don't typically see those two areas of the fraud triangle. We would just try to do our tests as auditors, and you should be doing your risk assessment as finance for that opportunity, to get rid of that opportunity, to make sure that it couldn't happen even if they wanted. Side note is the fraud triangle is actually developed by Donald Creasy in 1973. And I'm really curious if they had ERP systems back then, because it's completely, I mean, obviously not, but it's completely different environment now. But these three pieces still ring true. And there's been some developments since the fraud triangle. The fraud scale came out in 1984, and it replaces the rationalization with that personal integrity, right? So if somebody is, doesn't have integrity, maybe they brag about cheating on their taxes or getting one over on something else, that is a way that it would tip the scale more likely that they're prone to, if given the opportunity and having the pressure, that they are prone to do something fraudulent. And then the fraud triangle came out in 2004, and this adds the capability to the fraud triangle, or the fraud diamond came out in 2004, and this adds that capability piece that somebody has to be in a position and capable to commit, given an opportunity with the incentive and the rationalization. And with this one, I see the fraud diamond happening more in management. We had a client that was able to, there was a bond issue and there was a reserve for cash set up for, a bond was issued for a building, and there was a cash reserve set up for future payments for like landscaping. And being that this person was in a management position, they were able to falsify some invoices to start to draw down on that cash reserve, right? And they were able to because they were in management. And the thing that's interesting with the diamond is you see a lot of people that have that capability have an ego, and the ego really drives them to commit that fraud, right? It's like the Rita Crunwell. If you look, she was pretty much the only person in power in finance, right? Now, Dixon, Illinois. And she stole 54 million, I believe it was, over the course of about 20 years, and she was taking out an average of 2.5 million from a city that had a budget of anywhere between 8 and 9 million. And if you look at the pictures of the FBI auction, when they had to auction off all of her stuff, a lot of her jewelry had her initials on it. And so it really shows that ego and that being in a place to be capable really drove that fraud. Okay, so now we have our environment. Everyone's on board. We know where our risky areas is. Now we have to develop our control activities, and this is the checks and balances that we have built in to make sure that we're mitigating those risks. And the benefits always have to be cost effective. I have a client that they called me and they said, hey, we have 6 people reviewing every journal entry. Is that too much? And from an auditor, I'm like, that's great. Let's make it 7 or 8. But obviously that was a little too much of a cost for what was the benefit there. And so we understand as auditors, and usually we're pretty nice and help think outside the box in terms of how to have a strong control environment, even when there are very limited staff or not very many staff. And so there are ways with very small staffing to still have strong internal controls. And it might be appropriate that you have somebody on the governing board, review something. I had one water district where the treasurer, actually it was the chair of the board, had reviewed the bank statements, before they went to get the bank reconciliation. And just giving that layer of, hey, that bank statement is being reviewed really helped out and didn't cost a lot for that small district. The 5 types of control activities. We want to see these typically within every control activity: authorization, performance reviews, information processing, and then physical control. So who authorizes what? If a purchasing policy has strong controls built in it, who authorizes those approvals? Budget actual reports, performance reviews. We want to make sure that those are being done. Typically, we like to see them monthly, but typically that doesn't happen. It's usually done at the budget updates. So we want to see budget versus actual reports. Don't wait for us to give you our 100+ analytical questions to figure out why some expense changed a lot. We actually had a special district where they found fraud from this. They had a voucher system where they would reimburse up to like $100 a month for use of public transit. And they discovered that the person that was administering this program didn't really like doing it very much and was putting in false receipts and getting a voucher back for Clipper card, right? So on a given month, I think if I remember right, they said if the program was working correctly, it would have been like $2,000 a month that it cost this agency for this perk. On a given month where she was committing fraud, she was submitting claims for about $10,000. And the way they caught it is they were doing a budget actual review, and they saw that this benefit that they were providing was spiking. And we find typically in fraud that once it happens once, it tends to snowball. And their staffing at this district hasn't changed. We still have the X amount of employees, and we don't think more are using that much more, are using public transit. And in fact, if we take the total amount and divide it into our number of employees, that doesn't work out either because it's more than $100. So they were able to do analytical review and find that. Information processing. So this would be making sure that our financial system captures all the information. And there's really 2 types of controls from the information processing standpoint. You have application controls, and those are like the controls that would prevent you from putting the same invoice number twice. Or those would be controls that would tell you an error, right? Hopefully you have controls that tell you if your journal entries are out of balance in your system, where it's not just hitting cash. That's always a fun one. And then you have general IT controls, and those are the controls over your actual software, right? Making sure that there's adequate passwords, making sure that you have some kind of disaster recovery plan that you can be up and running to make sure the operations continue. Then we have physical controls for number 4. These are pretty easy, strong inventory, strong safekeeping of your capital assets. If you have a corp yard, make sure that it's locked. I always love seeing the key for the safe, dangling on the wall next to the safe. I recently had a client that they take a lot of cash in for transit, and they had the best time to do a cash collection site review is when the person in charge of it, the supervisor, is on vacation, just FYI. Because you learn a lot when somebody who doesn't really know what to say sometimes tells you what's going on. So what they were doing is, because they were taking a lot of cash for transit, and they would put the cash on top of the safe, and we're talking like $20,000 sitting on top of the safe, because the person that had the code to the safe or the key to the safe was going to lunch, and they didn't want to miss the armored truck coming and pick it up. So we got to make sure we have physical controls and they're actually working correctly. Segregation of duties. Again, this is really what we test when we do our interim phases of our audit. We want to make sure that we have segregation between the custody of the asset, and that could be, green cash, that could be a vendor database, that could be check stock, anything that has some kind of value, right, are separated from the authorization and the recording and reconciling. Right? So think of it from like disbursement standpoint. Can one person get a check out all the way through? And if you don't have segregation of duties, a small agency or something like that, there's got to be mitigating factors. There's got to be points in which somebody is reviewing to make sure that that person that has the assets, the authorizations, and the record keeping, and typically we see it as the custody asset and the record keeping. The same person that has access to the check stock also does the check runs and inputs it. So we want to make sure that there's strong mitigating factors. And with the remote work environment, we see that this is also kind of breaking down as people work more from home. And that sometimes one risk that we're seeing is the passing along of passwords or sharing of passwords and doing workarounds to make sure that that payroll gets done on time, that those checks go out. So I heard the other day a comment that workaround overrides from management, those are truly the enemies of a strong internal control environment. And when we do our testing of this, we have what's called the grid, and we have a list of all of the duties on the top, and then we have on the column, we have who has access to what. And anytime those things click or kind of connect, there's got to be some kind of control, okay? So now that we have our base, our risk assessment, and we built our controls so no one has access to the assets and record keeping, we've got to communicate the results. And this is from the information system. Our information system has to be able to record a transaction, accurately. So hopefully, like I said before, it doesn't have that auto balance to cash in our when we're booking journal entries. It has to resolve errors. So give you some kind of indicator that there is an error. It has to process and account for overrides. So can we see if something is being overridden? I had one where you could put the same invoice in twice, invoice number, but it would key it in a report that it was an override, basically, that it showed the system allowed somebody reviewing that to see that that invoice was in twice. Transfers between systems, it has to be able to, how are things getting into the GL? And a lot of times we see this breakdown of when we have, a separate system being done at the library or a separate system being done in the police or whatever, and how does that get into our financial reporting software? Capturing other information. So this would be, it has to be able to, maybe calculate depreciation, calculate allowance for doubtful accounts. And then our system has to be able to spit out financial reports, right? It has to be ensure that financial statements are reported accurately and that we can comply with our laws and regulations in terms of for financial reporting. So the communication system has to be relevant, right? Has to be reliable, relevant, and timely. Oh, so we have our results still coming in. And so for relevant or reliable, so we want to make sure that we have open lines of communication with our staff. So we're talking about how our risk assessment is being done, how our control activities are working, and how does that keep our control environment, that ethical behavior moving forward. So reliable Teams, Zoom, emails. Hopefully sometime we'll be meeting in person soon. Has to be clear and direct, relevant to the end user. I've heard a lot of people complain about people talking about too much personal stuff at Zoom meetings and stuff like that at organizations, and it just takes up time when a meeting should last 5 minutes. Now everyone's showing off their dog and it's an hour meeting. But it really should be relevant to that communication to our control environment and how it's working. And it should be timely. So many times we see that things are communicating way after the fact. If there is a new risk that is assessed, that has to be timely addressed, and it can't come after the fact. And we see sometimes breakdown in communication between departments, audit findings that don't get relayed to other departments. I had a client that we had an audit finding at their pool, and that was never shared with the pool manager. So our job descriptions and documented. Is everything clear about our role? Does everyone know through this communication what their role is? Does everyone know who they should be reporting to if they find something or see something or see a breakdown of internal control somewhere? Is there clear understanding of those lines of communication? And is it clearly communicated that management is really focused on internal controls and that's serious? Are the policies and procedures communicated when they change? Are the expectations communicated? If you see something, say something, right? Within like bank rec, payroll changes, vendor database changes. If you see issues, say something. Are the policies clear about who does what? Who is accountable and how that accountability, how that review will happen. We talk about the environment, right? There's got to be some kind of accountability for not following or following these guidelines. Are questions answered by the department for analytical reviews? Those quarterly updates, those monthly updates. Is that information communicated to the department of, hey, why are these things fluctuating? And then are things that the council and board adopts being actual adopted? Sometimes we see that things are discussed at like an audit committee, but maybe the department wasn't there or something wasn't communicated to staff. So we just want to make sure that those are being addressed. And at these staff meetings, right, it's a good way to communicate these issues. Is feedback welcome? You know, we want to make sure that we get feedback both up and down the chain of command here. Typically, we do a brainstorming session at the beginning of our continuing education here at Mays, and we call it barnacles, things that kind of just linger around that nobody understands why we really do, and you know, is there a better way to do that? And so we want to make sure that that communication line is open. In hindsight, actually, that transit voucher example I gave you, when it was communicated to that employee that they had a question because they saw it in an analytical review, a quarterly review of that expense, that employee went to lunch and never came back. So sometimes communication results in something like that. And then have the clear reporting channels for wrongdoing. The hot, an audit tip line or hotline, fraud hotline is the number one indicator of fraud, or 43% of all fraud comes from tips. So we want to make sure that there is that line of communication open to our staff, that if they see something, they say something, and that we have a good anti-retaliation policy, that staff training about the hotline, right? And make sure that allegations or tips or communication of wrongdoing are handled timely. Some issues we see in communication is just delay, like I said, in failure to report throughout the year. When we were talking about things that we found, new risks that management has identified and maybe not said to anybody, we want to make sure that formal policies and procedures are in place and it is known when those change. And in the financial statement close process, we want to make sure there's clear communication of who does what during the close and what things need to happen. And again, making sure that we're giving assignments based on position, not person. So if there is change, that won't slow down the financial close. And fee schedules, this is what I just wanted to bring up, because we see this a lot when there's change in a fee schedule and maybe IT isn't updated or isn't told to update the fee schedule online. Maybe the software is not updated correctly. So again, just that communication, so not only within finance, but even outside of finance. So monitoring, now that we have everything, we got to track it. We want to make sure that our policies and procedures are up to date, right? That any kind of communication that we have during our, of things that are working or not working on our internal control activities are being addressed. This is an ongoing process that we have to keep going to make sure that we're changing our control activities based on what's happening with our risk assessment, which is based on what's happening with the changing environment. So with shelter in place, work from home, what needs to be done to monitor? And this is one that really breaks down with everyone remote. There's a lot less monitoring going on that I feel, and that's a problem, because this is not a set it and forget it on your control activities. This is not, the Ron Popino or whatever that guy was on late night TV that had the info commercial. It's not a set it and forget it thing. We want to make sure our policies are up to date. I saw a purchasing policy not too long ago that still talked about ditto copies. That wasn't even around when I was in high school or anything. Policies update for cryptocurrency. Capitalization policies with low thresholds, is that still relevant? With the investment policy, LIBOR is going away. Do we need to change anything about that in our investment policy? Are our control activities still functioning? Are they still relevant with people working remotely? We still want to see that audit trail on our audits. And lastly, our monitoring the audit findings and see how those are being resolved. Okay, so that's our plan. And now we have to fight fraud. And this is where it's going to happen. Fraud will typically be misappropriation of assets. Unfortunately, with the finance people here, accounting, that's between department heads and accounting is where fraud typically happens. And within the accounting sector, it's usually misappropriation of assets. It's 53 for the accounting. Within a operational, like department heads, it's typically corruption. And the one thing that we don't talk about in our when we do our audits, we look at as auditors as for asset misappropriation and financial statement fraud, but the corruption, the kickbacks, the big bid rigging, all that is not really within our scope. And so that's why it's very important that you keep those risks in mind when you do your control activities. There was recently in the San Francisco, the department, I think it was the public works director, had was corrupt with a local entrepreneur and was giving this entrepreneur, deals or first rights on leased property and things like that. So that's not something that's really inside the scope of our audit on those side deals that don't run through finance. So, but it's something that you still need to keep in mind. So ways to fight fraud. So strong segregation of duties, right? You want that access to assets and the record keeping separated. And if you can't separate those, we understand that you have limited finance staff. We really want to make sure that there's strong mitigating factors, right? And it's not just a rubber stamp, it's a real detailed review based on professional skepticism. Why did we need our lawn mowed 8 times this week? So you got to keep that kind of investigative hat on when you're reviewing backup. Does it make sense? Or is the expense appropriate? Don't take it on its face value. I mean, people are so good about doctoring reports now and doctoring invoices that there are tips that you can do. There are things you can do to try to make sure that document is accurate and correct. Stop inappropriate access to your system. Like I said, with the people that had access to the vendor database, we want to make sure that the journal entry system, but even beyond that, even because if somebody had access to journal entries, that would be more of a financial reporting fraud, right? Or trying to hide a misappropriation of assets. But we want to make sure that there's not improper system access, that it's appropriate, and then we have an access log to review that. And any changes to that access log, we want that to be reviewed as well. Strong documentation review process. The review can be done physically or virtually. Right now, typically on my clients that are working remotely, I see a lot of email approvals. So there just has to be some kind of audit trail that we can see that second person, that mitigating factor is actually working. And for journal entries, make sure that the people reviewing the journal entries really do have that skills, knowledge, and expertise to review that. If they have a hard time with debits and credits, maybe that's not the best person you want reviewing your journal entries. Negative cash balance in the GL and inappropriate accounts for unmonitored. Again, we want to make sure that we're moving forward. I know sometimes people get hung up on unreconciled differences, especially like in bank recs or even reconciling some kind of subledger to the GL. Deposits payable has always been an issue. Anyway, so you keep moving forward. Don't let that stop you. Don't let a variance or an unreconciled difference in your bank rec stop you, because it might get flushed out in the next month, or it might be an issue. But if it stops you from doing bank recs going forward, that's a breakdown of your control activities, and now you're at risk for that opportunity because nobody's monitoring those bank accounts, right? That bank reconciliation. So cash deposits. So these are the 3 areas that I just want to bring up near the end here about where we typically see fraud happening. So cash deposits, we want to make sure those bank reconciliations are done timely. And I can't stress the timely bank reconciliation as a strong internal control. We want to make sure those bank reconciliations are detailed. And the person that does that bank reconciliation shouldn't have access to cash receipts, deposits, disbursement cycle. They shouldn't be opening bank statements. in the mail, if you guys still get them in the mail. It should be done by a separate person. Within bank transfers, everyone typically has those little fobs now, so that's a great control. That requires a second person to approve, so 2 people involved in each transfer. Within disbursements, the vendor database is key control. We want to make sure that our vendors are in that database are still vendors relevant, so somebody can't pick up an old vendor and start using it for fraudulent purposes. We want to make sure that the access to that vendor database is restricted to somebody that does not process payroll. A lot of times when we talk about access to system, we like it as auditors to not have a super user in finance. And sometimes that's not possible based on the organization, but we like the person outside of finance, typically like in IT, to be able to assign and unassigned users. So again, that breaks the link between that asset and the record keeping. Check register review, we want that done before the checks are issued, not after the fact. Strong purchasing policy that's being followed. We see a breakdown here where a lot of times purchasing policies are out of date, where they maybe use they don't use a PO anymore. Some of our smaller ones don't use a PO anymore. But that strong purchasing policy and review is key. We want to make sure that that vendor, that invoice that we have that we're reviewing is an actual invoice. With Google Streets and Google Maps, you can look up any kind of company and see if it's a real, brick and mortar, or is it just an open field? Run your employees' phone numbers against your vendor database and see what you find. If you find one that pops up, that could be indication of an issue. Within payroll, again, we don't want that. We want that access to changing pay rates outside of finance, if possible. So that would be in the HR. We want to see that the payroll registers are reviewed in the gross amount, not the net amount. We've seen instances where clients have increased their pay and then increased their withholding, so the net amount didn't change that much, and that would stick out if a review is more detailed done. Ghost employees, I just had a friend who works in the insurance industry tell me about, they just had a CFO that did a ghost employee scam on them. It was a landscaping company. And the kicker is, I always try to go through like the fraud triangle when this happens and see what broke down. And one thing that was really interesting about this case was that it's a CFO and it was a large company, and they didn't do a background check on that person. They didn't even call on the references on the resume. So it is very important that, especially people that touch cash and are within finance, that you have those background checks done and call on those references. Also can be done with number of employees. If you have a small organization like my small little district that has 4, if there was a ghost employee, that would stick out like a sore thumb. And then lastly, just to tell you why just fraud prevention and strong internal controls are key. This was done by KPMG, a review that they did in 2016, and 61% of all frauds are because of weak or no internal controls. As an auditor, we don't know if somebody is stressed out, the pressure, or disgruntled rationalization, but if we can knock it out, that fraud triangle by that third, that opportunity, if we can get that done, if we can get to a point where they could say, I couldn't have done it if I wanted, I mean, that's huge. And sometimes these people, everyone goes through hard times in their life. People are pretty stressed out now with the last year and a half. And stealing from a local government is not going to solve it. And if we can kind of help them, help themselves by not giving them that pressure, or not that pressure, but that opportunity, that want that, I can get it there, that would really help people out. And the hardest thing I find when looking at internal controls and fraud in general is the typical fraudster is not visible. That's the thing that's hard. It's typically somebody, with 1 to 5 years. 43% of cases are 1 to 5 years with the organization. 40% are between the ages of 35 and 45. But the older the fraudster gets, the higher the losses, because usually that would be that they're like department head or higher up. They don't go on vacation. They're very, very controlling over what they do. You know, they change their vacations for vacation, or they change their procedures for vacations they have, or something like that. You know, we're not going to do. I'll go on vacation after I do payroll, or to make sure I don't miss a payroll run. That's a problem. Within accounting department, it's usually check tampering and false invoices. With operations, we see that corruption, right? That kickback as the main issue. 86% of all fraudsters don't have a criminal record. A lot of organizations are embarrassed when these frauds happen and they don't report it. And if they don't report it, it doesn't go on their record. And so even if you did a background check on somebody, if it wasn't reported, it wouldn't pop up. 72% of all fraudsters are male. That's actually down a little bit. So we're starting to even out. It was 82 the year before. And one last thing just to leave you with before we have lunch and call it a day is that the number one red flag that a fraudster has is just the change in lifestyle. You know, when that person goes from that Honda to that Porsche, you know, when you see on their social media that they're, you know, in Hawaii all the time, or, you know, all these fancy restaurants, and we see that living up to that presentation of yourself on social media also is a pressure for people to try to steal, you know, to try to keep that lifestyle, keep that perception going. And that's another kind of external pressure that we don't really see within our organizations. But just keep your eyes open, keep your ears open. If you start to hear things of people being disgruntled, if you start to hear about money woes, really, really, really do your risk assessment, look at your internal controls, and fix that weak internal controls. I'm sorry, Catherine, I haven't been reading the polling questions. So in general, what percentage of fraud happens because of weak internal controls? I think they got that one. Perfect. Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Thank you, everyone, for participating in our Maze Live. We don't have any questions. Don't forget to fill out your survey if you need the credits. And we look forward to seeing you in person next year. And you guys have a great summer and happy audit.